suggest. Thanks.
Good morning and welcome to this policy dialogue, the Korea-EU Trade Policy Forum, where we're asking the question whether we are like-minded partners in the face of global transitions. I'm Fabian Zuleeg. I'm the Chief Executive of the European Policy Center, and I'm very glad to be organizing this together with the Korea Investment Trade Agency. I think Korea and the EU clearly have a very close relationship, not only trade, but clearly trade is an important component of that. And there have been these relationships for quite some time now. Certainly the FTA was a landmark, but it is also quite some time ago. The world has changed and there are many challenges now. We are talking about trade in the context of global friction, of a very different WTO, which is not functioning in the way in which it did 10 years ago. We're talking about a world in transition. Certainly when we look at European policy, there's a great emphasis on the digital and the green transition, and I'm sure that is also reflected in Korea. But that also has implications. It has implications for the kind of trade which takes place. There are discussions now, for example, on introducing a carbon border mechanism in the EU, again, an issue which will affect trade. And there has been a lot of discussion recently around supply chains, particularly in the field of semiconductors, but also in other areas. And how do we deal with the more contested environment in which we are? The EU has been talking about strategic autonomy. What does that actually mean? How do we go about making the European system more resilient, but without risking the global connections which are there? So all of this will influence the cooperation, and I think this is a great opportunity for us to have a discussion around where the common ground might be between Korea and the EU, also where the disagreements might be, and how we can progress this relationship further. I will start with an intervention by the minister, and then I will have each panelist in turn, and I will introduce them as we go along. But we start with the minister, Han-koo, who is Minister for Trade in Korea. Very glad that you could make it, and good to also see you in person. So the floor is yours.
Yeah. Good morning. Thank you very much. First of all, Dr. Zuleeg for the very kind introduction. I've heard that this is a first sort of in-person event since the pandemic. So it looks like it's almost first time in 2 years. So I'm very honored and very pleased to have such an extraordinary opportunity today. I'm very pleased to be here at the European Policy Center. This continues my tour of meeting trade experts on the continent. And just yesterday, I was in Geneva, the ivory tower of trade policy and onkiness, where I learned a lot on issues facing our community. I'm looking forward to building on that today with this distinguished panel today. As we all know, global trading environment is undergoing a rapid paradigm shift in the wake of COVID-19. We are seeing the post-war international trading order of the past 7 decades shaken at the core. with a foundation consisting of rule-based trade, free trade, and multilateralism at the risk of eroding away. At the same time, we are seeing new issues emerging in our trade policy agenda, including securing a more resilient supply chain, digital transition, and climate change that are intended to achieve various objectives that are of industrial, national security, and environmental nature. So on this year, as we celebrate 10th year anniversary of the Korea-EU FTA, we are urged to further strengthen the Korea-EU cooperation in 5 strategic areas, including supply chain, the trade and technology, digital trade, vaccines, and climate change. By recalibrating the Korea-EU FTA framework in tandem with a paradigm shift of the rapidly changing global trade environment. Against this backdrop, let me now help set the tone of our discussion today and touch upon the current state of the play in the bilateral trade cooperation between Korea and EU. First, on supply chain. Korea-EU cooperation over semiconductor and battery supply chain is a prime example of mutually beneficial bilateral economic cooperation. In semiconductors, Korean and European companies are closely collaborating each other by combining their respective strengths, namely Korea's world-class manufacturing capacity and Europe's cutting-edge technologies for manufacturing equipment, thereby creating much synergy. Many Korean battery companies also have local manufacturing presence in the European Union, contributing to the EU's battery supply chain. I believe trade policy can and should provide additional support to further expand cooperation in supply chains and enhancing their resilience across the other industrial sectors as well. Second, Korea and EU have rich industrial and trade experience with technology cooperation and protection and standard development, which will support development of new technologies such as AI, 5G, and 6G. In this vein, I believe Korea and the EU trade authorities need to establish such a cooperation channel to discuss and troubleshoot trade-related issues in emerging technology, especially considering their growing complexity and the fast-paced changes. Third, we are witnessing the growing importance of establishing rules of digital trade. As part of the new trading order, specifically in consideration of the accelerating pace of transition into a digital economy. In this vein, we very much welcome the EU's plans to explore the possibility of new digital partnership agreement with Korea as part of the recently announced EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. I believe Korea and the EU can demonstrate a best practice in digital trade through establishing new trade rules and expanding cooperation, especially with Korea's strength in ICT and strong drive for the digital trade agreement. Fourth, Korea and the EU can further strengthen their cooperation in vaccine. Rapid boosting production and equitable distribution of vaccine have become two of the most critical issues of the today in the wake of COVID-19. One solution to this problem is to substantially boost production capacity, which is possible by combining EU's core technologies with Korean production capacity, as already demonstrated by its production of 4 different COVID-19 vaccines and Korea's second largest biopharma production capacity in the world. Finally, there is much potential for Korea-EU cooperation in response to climate change, which we are facing today together as an international community. Korea and the EU can contribute greatly together towards carbon neutrality objectives if we expand cooperation in joint renewable energy projects such as solar PV and offshore wind, and also in establishment of global value chains for hydrogen production, distribution, and consumption. One thing I must note in relation to climate change is the rising concern of some non-EU countries on EU's CBAM measures. Nonetheless, I'm convinced that EU's CBAM measures will be implemented in order to prevent carbon leakage issues in a manner fully consistent with the WTO agreement and will not serve as a new barrier to an international trade. I very much hope that EU will actively consider exclusion for those non-EU economies that have ETS in place, which is similar to the EU's, like Korea. Also, we need to work together to explore how we can incorporate various carbon pricing efforts around the world into our international trading system in a consistent and coherent manner. And also, how we can further facilitate trade in goods, services, and technologies that will help accelerate the pace of green transition. In addition to these 5 areas of strategic bilateral cooperation, Korea and EU are urged to strengthen their cooperation more closely than ever in multilateral context. As we can all agree, the multilateral trading system with the WTO at the center has been the most powerful engine of global economic growth, with both Korea and the EU as largest beneficiaries. With intensifying concern with the WTO being in a crisis, we need to achieve tangible outcomes at the MC12 to restore the functions, confidence, and relevance of the WTO, especially given that the MC12 is the first ministerial conference taking place in 4 years. In particular, I hope to see Korea and the EU demonstrating their leadership together as WTO members work towards deliverables on the trade and health initiative in response to COVID-19, as well as fishery subsidies negotiation, which will serve as an indicator for modernizing WTO's rules going forward. I very much look forward to benefiting from your insight today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister, for touching on all of the issues which we want to discuss today, and we'll have an opportunity to go in more depth on all of those. And we'll start with the supply chain issue. And for that, I will ask Frederico Mollet, who's a policy analyst within the European Policy Center.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay through the mic. Okay. So I want to touch a little bit on this paradigm shift, particularly in the context of supply chains, because I think this is the area where it is most clear how the thinking of international policymakers is changing in relation to how the global economy works. Because I think for the past 20, 30 years, the view was very much that governments would set the rules, the regulatory frameworks, and then the private sector could go along, set international supply chains that crisscrossed national boundaries in quite a finely segmented division of international labor. But the specific workings of any one of those supply chains was more or less a mystery to policymakers at the top. These were all subsumed within aggregate economic flows. But the nature of the shocks that we've been experiencing recently, from the pandemic, but also geopolitical shocks in terms of how particularly the semiconductor supply chain has been leveraged at specific bottlenecks, has had to change policymakers' approach to how they view supply chains, I think. I mean, this is still an evolving process, but I think that's the direction that we're heading in. Because now we've had to become involved with the specifics of how any one supply chain works, whether a factory producing lipid nanoparticles is located in Europe, and whether it is delivering at the adequate pace. It's a level of detail and granularity that policymakers haven't had to grapple with, I think, for a while, at least outside of some sort of specialized areas such as the military and security establishment. And I think this is going to continue. It's not just a transient shock that we're experiencing. We'll continue to see, I think, geopolitical pressures drive this more granular thinking. And although the pandemic is now easing, we can still see it impacting our supply chains. And there are further shocks to come in terms of climate-related shocks, potential new pandemics, which we know are coming at an accelerated pace. And so this new mantra of security and resilience, I think, will continue for quite some time and will change the way in which policymakers start to think and address the questions of the international economy. What does that mean going forward? I think that's still a little unclear because I think this is a step change in how people think. I think what is clear is the cooperation will be essential. These are collective global public goods, these supply chains. They're incredibly efficient. They've shown quite a lot of resilience in the face of the shocks that have come over the past 2 years or so. But nevertheless, I think that we'll start to see more interventions, but to make sure that those interventions are not counterproductive, that we don't get rid of the various advantages that these supply chains have granted global producers and consumers, I think that there will have to be careful deliberations between different partners about the measures that they take to make sure that they don't gum up the international system and that they are proactive in doing so. I mean, semiconductors is the most kind of recent high topical example, but I'm sure that it will come up in other areas. We already see in the TTC, the Supply Chain Working Group, I think, addresses a number of other areas other than semiconductors, such as energy and raw materials. I think given the shocks from the pandemic and how they have impacted different bottlenecks, it's also worth considering what kind of joint interventions could have maybe alleviated some of the pressures we've seen and are still seeing. For example, we still see issues with vaccine supplies to areas of the world which are manufacturing hubs and are hence acting as bottlenecks because factories need to close down. I'm thinking particularly of Vietnam here. We see issues with sailors that man the international shipping lanes being stuck because they're not sufficiently vaccinated, and it seems something where international coordination could have really helped alleviate some of these issues. You also see, for example, the misbalance or imbalance in where containers are stuck around the world, which emerged during COVID, and how that is gumming up the international trading system. Whether, for example, I mean, these were the decisions of private players that were rational within their own context, but in aggregate have led to these imbalances. They will work themselves out eventually. But, for example, could some kind of international subsidy that would have enabled empty containers to go back to Asia have in hindsight, avoided some of the bottlenecks we're seeing. I think there's also a conversation that needs to be had with the private sector and public authorities to make sure that the private sector in its supply chain decisions really incorporates the knowledge about the shocks to come, particularly climate-related shocks. I'm not sure to the extent that the various different players are really taking into account the severity of the shocks that might come. And I think that there will need to be international coordination to make sure that some kind of adequate response and preparation is done, including helping, I think, capacity building in countries which are manufacturing hubs and important sections of the global supply chain so that they are resilient to the types of shocks which the climate change will continue to bring. I'm going to wrap it up there because I don't want to take up any more time, and I'm sure that there's many distinguished guests with more important points to make, but that would be my 2 cents on the supply chain aspect of these discussions.
Thanks, Frederico, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. One of the themes in your intervention was coordination and cooperation. Of course, we have the multilateral system, and the minister was talking about addressing some of the shortcomings. So what are we expecting for the WTO and the multilateral system? And for that, I'll turn to Yves Melin, partner at Reed Smith.
Thank you very much. Geneva, the WTO. So the position of the EU on the WTO is that we should restore the dispute settlement system mechanism as soon as possible. That's the top priority of the EU among a number of other priorities, with a realization that this is probably not going to happen anytime soon. And so I'm going to review a bit what the EU has been saying about WTO, what it wants to do, and then what it has done in practice in order to address the present. And so when you hear and read what the EU says about the WTO, as I said, it first wants to restore a functioning dispute settlement mechanism. You probably all know that we don't have a functioning appellate body anymore, so that when disputes reach panel level, the panel issues a report, there is no place to appeal and have a final resolution of disputes. That obviously creates difficulties, because the way the WTO works is that you have to wait until the appellate body reports before you retaliate and levy duties in order to rebalance the distortions created by another WTO partners. And so how do you do that if you don't have a functioning appellate body? I'll come to that in a second. The EU is also speaking about more aspirational wishes for reform on fisheries, discussions on digital trade, services and investments, the willingness to address more forcefully state-owned enterprises and industrial policies, subsidies. There you can read China written all over the place. These are the more traditional sectors, and then you will also read the Commission and the EU talk about the sustainable agenda, so health, the protection of the environment, and fisheries. And it's fair to say that our assessment, maybe the Commission will not be this straightforward, but it won't be that straightforward about it, but the hopes that any of this is going to be resolved soon are fairly small. We have the ministerial conference at the end of November, beginning of December, with all those ambitions being repeated, with a big focus on restoring the dispute settlement mechanism that works. Initially, the EU wanted everything to be solved for November. Now we'll be happy if the discussion starts, trying to resolve the issue for the next ministerial conference. No one expects this to move until the US engages, and the US is not engaging on this, so you can't negotiate alone, certainly not in the WTO, so we'll see what happens. What is more interesting to see and to witness is the transformative impact that the dysfunction of the WTO has had on the EU's approach to multilateralism. And there I'll say a few words about the fix, which is called the Multi-Party Interim Appeal Arbitration Arrangement, which is the MPIA. It's an ad hoc appellate body mechanism that the EU and a number of other WTO members has created. This is the way the EU and these other WTO members have decided to live the new normal. And this mechanism essentially replicates the existing appellate body mechanism without change. And so countries that have subscribed, we have now 25 countries member of the mechanism. Countries have agreed that all their disputes will go through that ad hoc mechanism and will be resolved with an appellate body. There are 8 cases now. There hasn't been any appeal yet, but there will be an appeal, and so those disputes are solved in the traditional way. Now, what happens with the countries that are not part of the MPIA? The EU has modified its internal rules to be able to retaliate without a solution at the WTO level. And so now, if you have a dispute with a country that is not, if the EU has a dispute with a country that is not a member of the MPIA, there will be a panel, a report. If the EU wins and the losing member appeals it before the dormant appellate body, the EU says, okay, then I win and I retaliate as if I won. They won't wait for an enforcement panel of the WTO. If the EU loses, they appeal, and then there's no resolution. So that is in a nutshell, new normal for the EU in terms of dispute settlement. It could stay for a while, as I said. No one predicts the appellate body to be reformed quickly, and certainly not before the US engages. It doesn't look like the US is going to engage quickly. We'll see about that. And then that's not enough because you have the world. But it's fair to say that the system as it has been designed works for the EU. And so if you look at what are the big transformative changes in the trade sphere, like Minister, you spoke about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, this is unaffected by any of this. This is the transformative change for the EU's trade policy, possibly resulting in a new levy at the EU's border, which could be very substantial while the WTO is there to remove levies, and this is taking place completely beside the WTO, largely or entirely unaffected by the fact that it's not there to solve disputes. And with that, I'll finish my presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and it'll be interesting to go back to see in how far Korea sees itself interacting with these new mechanisms, but also in how far we see a realistic prospect for reform of the WTO. But first, we'll turn to another one of the big topics which have already been mentioned, maybe the big topic, the existential topic, climate change, and how that interacts in the trade sphere. So I'll turn to Isabelle Garzon, who's Director of Studies and Development at the Europe Jacques Delors.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the time when 10 years ago a trade agreement was about goods and services have long gone. And I think they were already going fast at the time. And indeed, as Minister said, today trading partners have more to deal with non-trade issues than trade issues themselves. And I believe in the context of the EU-Korean partnership, this is very true, and you demonstrated it already in the few areas you mentioned. So indeed, a true partnership between like-minded countries cannot but discuss the issue of climate change and climate policies and tools that will influence the way we trade globally and bilaterally in a way which reduces the impact of trade and economic production on carbon emissions. So I come to the topic that is very much on the public discussion. I would first say that let us not forget that the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is part of a major energy package, and the biggest, largest, most fundamental energy package that the EU is supposedly about to approve. That was presented by the European Commission on the 14th of July this year, the famous Fit for 55. So it's a complete overhaul of all the energy regulations, standard regulations, the standards for cars and vans. This is part of it. I think this is the context which is very important to have in mind. CBAM is aimed at preventing carbon leakage as soon as, in a few years down the road, the full package will be implemented, hopefully, with strong reductions in carbon emissions imposed on the whole economic system. For as long as it remains this objective, a true environmental objective, I think it is fair to say that it is a legitimate measure to be pursued. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is important in relation to the Fit for 55 package, is that CBAM mirrors the carbon trading system of the EU, the ETS. It's the same principle. An importer, like any economic operator subject to the ETS, will have to buy carbon credits. and surrender them at the end of the year when he has done the calculations of the goods imported. And therefore, this idea that this is the mirror provision of a domestic system is very important as well. We in Jacques Delors have published several papers saying that for as long as this is something which applies to all economic operators in the EU domestically and externally, this is a non-discriminatory measure from a WTO perspective. And in effect, there is more to that, because we were also a little bit relieved by the fact that the proposal does not discriminate against any country or treats every country, third country, the same. There have been many talks along the preparations. We should exclude these or that type of countries. But there is another important element, which is very fundamental as well, is that they are smart enough to say to avoid double taxation, in the sense of recognizing that, of course, countries which have in place a similar system of carbon pricing, that is where you have an exporter which already in its own country have internalized the cost of carbon, then this will be deducted from the import, that is excluded from exempted from the CBAM. And of course, this is very important for Korea, because it's, as far as I know, one of the rare, if not the only other third countries in Europe that has an ETS in place. So I think this is very fundamental, and this is where I come to the next step. What do we do from there, from a point of view of EU-Korea relationship? I think it's fair to say that the EU has a lot to do in terms of, well, internally to get the thing passed, and with these fundamental principles preserved in the legislative process. This is not a done deal from this international trade law perspective. But externally, I think there is a lot to do in terms of entering into the substance of the discussion. The legitimacy of the CBAM, I think, is there. The way it will be implemented and the type of cooperation and discussion in carbon pricing, climate policies in general, but carbon pricing in particular, and therefore how concretely the EU will be able to effectively, economically sound and legally secure way to start counting the carbon cost of imports. I think this is the major challenge from an international cooperation point of view. And I like, personally, the approach taken by Korea until now, say, let us go to the multilateral table or to a multilateral forum framework and go down step by step the issues. What finally to conclude, I think there is the EU, the European Commission was probably smart to start with relatively simple products, and it would be wise to focus only on these. We know that they are not going to change the whole value chain and reduce dramatically the emissions, but still they trigger something. And if we are serious about the impacts of carbon emissions on through trade, we have to be serious with those four very high emitters of carbon. These five sectors: aluminium, iron and steel, electricity, fertilizers. So I would say focus. Cooperation on the very technical economic assessment of carbon pricing and the various ways countries are going to do that. the policy space of each countries, how do we accommodate this? And finally, just as an outlook, a little bit of an outlook, the issue of societal demands and probably economic actors' demands as well to increase regulations for sustainability on the domestic market in the EU at least. Demand from operators to have some sort of playing field, and in any case, international rules making, which do not exist, point to the fact that maybe CBAM is only a first. There are other type of new market import regulation by the EU. You talked about how the global situation is making the EU changing its approach. I would add this one. Autonomous measures pointing to the EU choosing deciding the type of imports it will from now on accept on its market. Is where we're going to go. So the need to succeed is imperative, in particular with this CBAM. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, in this first round, we'll turn to the other transition, the digital or the much broader technology transition we're seeing. And I'll give the word to Hosuk Lee-Makiyama, who's director at the European Center for International Political Economy.
Thank you, Fabian. I have a particular relationship with Korea and Europe, as you can see. I have the same passport as Greta Thunberg, but also, as you can clearly see, my origins are Korean. And but most of all, when I was working for the Swedish government, we actually managed to pass the EU-Korea FTA. And I do dare say that, as 10 years have passed, I would like to diverge slightly from your view that we have come to a completely different space when it comes to trade agreements. You never really forget your first relationship, your first partner. And I have to say, all the children we had with other FTAs seem to have Korean cheekbones. They look very similar to the EU-Korea FTA. So we actually conceived something very beautiful together, which was actually the European bilateral template for FTAs. For that, we have actually we share a bond that goes beyond like-mindedness, which is actually about objectives. And with that said, although we never forget Korea, we have to remember that Korea is special to us, but also Korea is special in its own right. Because as far as I can see, Korea has a very, very unique policy space when it comes to the trade. Let me just explain perhaps to the European audience. Can you imagine a country that covers 100% of the trade through preferential agreement? It has an FTA with Europe, United States, and China. It is exempt from Section 232 tariffs. I think someone here in the panel may have something to do with that effort. And also, it has an adequacy decision from the European Union. And it has an FTA with practically all the TPP countries, and it is a member of the RCEP. So when I say that Korea has a very, very unique policy space to actually to do whatever that's possible, what you can do now in trade is actually quite an understatement. And I think we should be very flattered that Korea, therefore, is at our table here in Europe when Korea can be anywhere in the world. And with that said, Korea has also a unique policy option that no one else has. It can observe very carefully and wait and see what happens. It does not have to join TPP if it doesn't want to. It can shape the rules of trade through other means. One is, of course, the bilateral track. I don't speak for Korea or Europe for that matter, But I mean, if I was looking at the options I had at the table, many joined TPP in order to change the gold standard of the trade rules in the Indo-Pacific. But in fact, Korea can actually speak directly on digital rules with USTR or with us, because I believe that our FTAs are due for modernization, and we have many like-minded views, as we have said. It has also the option to go to the WTO, and I would like to diverge slightly from the view there as well, that MC12 is already de facto a failure. A summit never fails at the summit. The failure of the summit is actually created 1 year before, prior to the negotiation. And if you look at the policy space of the other big players, Korea has, of course, as I said, a very wide policy space, but it's extremely narrow in Beijing, Washington, and Brussels, and not to mention Delhi and in Cape Town. These are the principal places where things are decided. It's not in Geneva. And with that said, I mean, it does not, a change in the WTO, including fisheries, doesn't come for free. And the fact is that no one in the global trading system, except for Korea, can actually afford to pay to get anything done. Because as far as the domestic policy dictates, unfortunately, trade is not the solution for the number 1, number 2, or even down to the number 10 problem that many of the leading countries are going through at the moment. So this reflects in the fact that nobody is ready to play the role of demandeur. If no one is ready to pay, that means that you don't get anything in return. And that's a reality you have to deal with. And I think that Korea has a unique role to play here, because it is actually a partner that is of an equidistance to all. We need to remember that Europe is not a neutral, unbiased partner. Europe is not the middle ground in WTO. It's actually by some countries seen as a very extremist power for reasons that we have already heard in the panel. And on other issues, I would say that we are also perhaps paying the price for choosing a WTO DG who had no technical expertise of a technically very complicated organization. We had the choice of choosing a candidate that actually had a very excellent WTO expertise and a trade negotiation experience. We chose a different path. One may say that WTO members are now paying the price for choosing a different path. But management may be exercised by the DG of the WTO, but the leadership is always exercised by the member states. And here's where I think that Korea could take the lead in thinking about what is the landing zone, given that the catastrophe or the failure of the WTO is a reality. And to be fair, we have been living that reality for the past 10 years. What do we do in the ashes of it? And here's where I urge countries like Korea to play a very constructive role. I know that Korea is a very respected member of Ottawa Group and other constellation, but the status quo that we are advocating does not exist anymore. We are now living in a reality where even some members are actually vetoing a trilateral amongst like-minded countries that does not affect them. I'm thinking about the JSIs. So that is the reality we're playing, and we as Europe has to actually rely on countries that are on equidistance like Korea in order to make things happen. I'd like to go back to the question about bilateral, because I said that Korea has other options than TPP and it can play a unique role in the WTO, but I do really want to emphasize the fact that the EU and Korea is up for a upgrade of its FTA. Digital issues are obvious. Obviously, cross-border data flows, government access to data, these issues were not on the table back in 2010. They were, but they were usually driven by lowly paid officials like me who no one listened to. But now we are living in a completely different reality. And with that said, I think Korea here really needs to think about its offensive interest vis-a-vis digital, which does not necessarily have to be the same as United States or Japan, where there are actually quite a lot of similarities when it comes to, for example, certain sensitivities. For example, we are talking about fundamental rights, data privacy, and also to a certain term, also security is an aspect that we have to look into. And I would like to add the fact that Korea is actually venturing to DEPA. You are acceding to the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, which opens up another door. And this is a modularly built agreement between New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore. And Korea is now going to play the role that the United States were supposed to play because TPP was actually originally created by TPP4 that the United States acceded to. Korea is now actually in a situation to actually transform the agreement. And I don't know, but it would be very interesting to see what kind of offensive interest that are uniquely Korean into that agreement, which we'll probably see also in the EU-Korea upgrade talks. I'm thinking, for example, semiconductors that we have heard in expert detail, but also a question perhaps like export control could be of a major issue that I know that is straining some bilateral relationships. To wrap up, I think Europe is now focused on the narrative of strategic autonomy, which Fabian also mentioned. But you know, future of Asia is about strategic alliances. We hear about like-minded partners in the face of global transitions. But you know, unless you can't operationalize that like-mindedness into real concrete policy outcomes, like-mindedness doesn't have a meaning. And one particular area of this, I think, is the climate change issue that we've heard. I think that as a fundamental importance, we've heard to great detail about Korea is in essentially equivalent to the EU ETS system. It produces different market results, yes, that's sure, that the Korean ETS, for the time being, this week, is cheaper. Is that a policy problem? Not really. And we have to think consequentially when we approach a question like CBAM against our like-minded partners who have implemented de facto same system. If you want to have equalization, if you want to actually offset the difference in price in carbon, any country in the world will say that you can do that about land prices, labor, you can do that about fuel, anything. And it exposes us to a very sensitive weakness, which we haven't really thought about. So what I'm trying to say here is that the legality of CBAM, when it comes to the necessity of it in addressing carbon leakage, and especially considering the fact that Korea is, from what I understand from the data I've seen, less carbon intensive than many European countries. It will be very, very difficult from the perspective of trade law to justify that measure against countries like Korea, but also other countries that had already an ETS system in place. I'm not talking about morals, I'm not talking about ethics, I'm not talking about the policy outcome vis-a-vis carbon leakage, but this will be extremely difficult to justify in a trade dispute in the WTO. So it will not just be the massive polluters who will take Europe to a potential trade dispute. If we don't actually square this circle around carbon leakage and people who are actually better than us in addressing climate change could potentially take us to the WTO as well. And that comes back to what like-minded actually means. It does not always mean being more Korean. It doesn't mean always being more European. We can't expect Asian countries, sovereign Asian countries, to think European. But we do have similar objectives. And we have to take every path of the way that take us further, because there are not that many options out there. And some countries, like Korea, have more options than Europe has. And we have to actually use that to our advantage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hosuk. We've heard quite a wide range of different issues, and I want to open it also to the other panel members to react. But first, I would like to go back to you, Minister, on any reflections on what you've heard.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for really the brilliant and insightful comments and perspective from all these panelists. There are so many things on the plate, but let me just share some of my few thoughts after hearing from our panelists. On supply chain, when we look at our bilateral relations from the supply chain perspective, Korea and European Union are very much interdependent and interconnected in terms of this supply chain in semiconductor and batteries. For example, one of the first companies that I visited after I was appointed was ASML Korea. And as you know, they have this state-of-the-art cutting-edge technology which enables the production of chips, along the supply chain in semiconductor. So I think this kind of making our supply chain stronger and more resilient in this critical industry would be one of important policy agenda for Korea and EU. Of course, all these groundwork will be done by this private sector, but obviously there are critical role to be played by government and public sector in this area. And also, these days, a lot of new Korean investments are flooding into European Union. For example, in this cutting-edge technology of the EV, these batteries. Recently, Korean companies invest in Poland and Hungary, for example. So in this green technology, we are also interconnected in the supply chain. So I think we need to explore some sort of dialogue channel under the frame of Korea-EU FTA to discuss and troubleshoot these whatever issues or problem arising from this supply chain and trade-related matters. So that's my comment on supply chain. And WTO and dispute settlement system, and also some of the positive or negative assessment of where we are in terms of this MC12 and WTO reform. In fact, we had very, very intensive discussion in the OECD and WTO mini-ministerial in Paris. And in fact, I think many of ministers left Paris with a more positive, more optimistic, and more hopeful note. I think we have to manage our expectation. It's in the middle of pandemic, and then it's the MC ministerial conference, first time happening in 4 years, and then we are less than 2 months away from the MC12. So I think we cannot expect too much. But if we really strategize and prioritize what we can achieve in this less than 2 months' time, I think that could be a very meaningful exercise. I made a point in my opening remark that the trade and health issue and also this fishery subsidy could be one of the deliverables that we can aim to achieve at MC12. I think it's doable. I think the ministers in Paris gave kind of a strong political commitment and strong willingness to engage and really strive to make things happen at MC12. So I think the real game started from now on, leading up to this MC12. From now on, that is a critical thing, and depending on how and what we do from now on in less than 2 times, I think that could make a difference. So I still remain optimistic and hopeful on the outcome of MC12. And on this WTO reform issue, I think we have to really strategize what we can achieve in short term, in less than 2 months' time, and what we can achieve in the beyond MC12, in a more longer term. Obviously, this WTO reform is not an easy matter. We need much more time and the full the deliberation on this the specific elements of WTO reform, especially this dispute settlement mechanism. So, from Korea's perspective, we could be able to agree on, this political willingness to start discussing intensively on these specific elements of WTO reform and some of our timeline and the process that we are going to pursue in order to reach the outcome and the conclusion that we want at the end of the day. I think that could be considered meaningful achievement at MC12. So that's my comments on the WTO and dispute settlement, the dispute settlement. Climate change, I think that's the fascinating topic, and I think in a sense, I think the European Union's this attempt to roll out this CBAM, I think it has positive impact around the world. During this trip, I also met with many European businesses as well as Korean business while I was in Korea. But I think with this CBAM in play, I think businesses around the world began to really seriously think about how to cope with this the CBAM-like measures. I think it may not be the only or last one initiated by any sovereign countries. We are seeing kind of similar attempts from here and there around the world. So I think EU made a contribution in a sense that EU sort of mainstream this policy discussion and policy idea of how to incorporate this global carbon pricing into this day-to-day international trading mechanism. So in that sense, I think EU made a great contribution to cope with this climate change in trade space. But I think what is important is from now on, because obviously there could be kind of setback if EU doesn't attempt to have this close coordination and consultation with international, this like-minded country, which have similar system as EU. Then I think it could cause real chaos, right? I think Mr. Hosuk rightly pointed out, Korea's ETS is very well organized and well prepared for the last several years, obviously emulating the EU's experience in ETS system. So if EU is from now on begin to have this coordinated consultation with this like-minded country which have similar system as EU, then I think it could be a motivation for other countries to introduce this kind of ETS system as soon as possible to proactively prepare for this kind of a new mainstream trend. So that's what I'm trying to discuss with EU officials, and how EU and Korea can work together to mainstream this global carbon pricing, how to incorporate it into global trading system. And I think that this Korea's example, how EU and Korea coordinate on this approach could really send a strong signal to the rest of the world. And in the climate change area, I think CBAM is not the only one. Korea, with other like-minded country in the WTO setting, we put forward a proposal on initiating new rounds of these, environmental goods, and services. The tariff reduction, the round. I think that is also, another interesting topic that we can develop in close cooperation with the European Union. I think Mr. Hosuk Lee-Makiyama made a very, very thoughtful and the comments on where Korea's trade policy and what kind of the unique and special policy options that Korea has. On modernization of Korea-EU FTA, we believe that I think it's the right time that we begin to think about strategically how we can upgrade this 10-year-old, this backbone of our economic cooperation. I think strategically, Korea and European Union are in the very, the good position to collaborate with each other. President Moon, put forward this new Southern policy in early 2017, and now European Union also put forward this Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think we share this common strategic interest in the region, and also in the midst of this uncertainty surrounding G2 competition in many areas of industry, technology, and trade, I think Korea, EU have a lot in common. Korea and European Union are highly industrialized, the high tech, and also this, this free trade, the strong believer of multilateralism. So we have a lot in common to offer to the rest of the world in the midst of this uncertainty and the unstable global trading environment. I'll stop here and I'll come back to any other topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very aware that we're constrained in terms of time, so I will go back to each of the panelists, but I will ask you to limit it to 1 minute each. I know that is difficult, but just to pick up the key point you might want to react to. Maybe a couple of things which I would find interesting. One is a question really from a European perspective. In how far do you think domestic politics, domestic public opinion is limiting the ability of the EU to cooperate internationally, given that trade has become a much more contested area where a lot of other objectives are now being added in. And the other area, I think, which I thought was coming through in all of the contributions, the question of standards and how we can cooperate more on standards to have a global system which works for Korea and the EU. I'll go in the same order as I did before, so please, 1 minute each.
I'll try and keep it very brief, and I totally agree with your point, Fabian, on the importance of standards in all these discussions, but I want to pick up on the Minister's point around semiconductors and mutual dependencies, and I think it's absolutely right that when we discuss these supply chains, mutual dependency and dialogue over our mutual dependencies is really important. But I think it's also important to distinguish in these discussions that there is a security and resilience element where mutual dependency is a very important aspect, and then there's an industrial policy element where often the industrial policy is described in terms of security and resilience, but it's actually to do with increasing high-value activities, economically high-value activities within our domestic borders. And I think that's an important part of the semiconductor discussion. And so I think any dialogue, as well as addressing the issues of mutual dependency and resilience and so forth, needs to address, what are legitimate industrial policy actions, because within Europe, I think the semiconductor issue is to a large extent driven by the realization that we're falling a little bit behind in some of the more high-value areas of the modern economy, and we need to catch up. But how can that be done in a way that is market conforming and still preserves the advantages of the international trading system? So I think that tension is an important one to manage. And if we think about purely in terms of security and resilience, I think that is a bit obscured sometimes.
Yves.
I fully agree. The EU is very much willing to restore multilateral discussions, and having those agendas and solving those issues multilaterally is something that the EU wants deeply. But the present is bilateral, and if we look back at the carbon issue and its compatibility with WTO and what the EU is going to do in that context, I think that the EU has to make a system that is not discriminatory. That's very important, and indeed it has to recognize the efforts that others have done, starting with Korea. But in the other sense, there needs also to be engagement by third countries. And so countries that don't engage with the EU will find it very hard to complain that the EU has been discriminatory against them. And I would like also to note that for the EU, like for Korea, we are a carbon poor in terms of hydro oil for production. And so the interest to protect the environment and reduce carbon in the atmosphere is just one of the concerns for the EU. The other concern is to become autonomous in the energy that we produce. And so this file is just too big to fail. And so the third countries like Korea are very right to engage with the EU, because this is going to happen, and it's going to happen bilaterally before it moves to multilateral.
Thanks, Isabelle.
I was trying to connect your two questions because, in fact, the EU has thought that filling the void, the multilateral void by bilateral FTAs would do the trick, but to an extent it did. I mean, for growing exports and imports of goods, yes, certainly, but it doesn't do the trick for dealing with the issues that we just discussed today. Value chains are spread over a number of countries, touch about a number of regulatory environments and policy areas, and any other standards will have to face different policy environments and choices made by the different trading partners. So if we are serious, and the EU is serious to, let's say, re-engage, but also, let's say, promote the Green Deal, let's say, it's only partly through bilateral discussions that will be achieved. It's through the re-engagement in new forms of multilateral cooperation, finding new ways, new ideas, new systems of dealing with not even approximation of standards, I was going to say, but recognition, equivalence of policies rather than standards. So this is a huge challenge for the future of the cooperation in the trade system, and I very much doubt that this is going to take place in the WTO or in the WTO alone. You need other fora to discuss the rightliness of climate policies, of carbon pricing, or impacts on biodiversity, etc. And I think this is what holds until now, to answer your question about public opinion. Public opinion probably has realized that FTAs are not going to do this trick. Hence, in over the years, this more and more increasing reluctance, doubts, or even protests. So I think these two issues are linked, and hence the importance to recall what everybody has said, that countries like Korea call on also the EU to re-engage, but contribute as well to re-engage into different ways, in inventing different ways. I'm not discarding the role and importance of the WTO, not at all, but I'm saying that this needs to be complemented in new forms of governance of public goods.
Thank you. We are pretty much out of time, Hosuk. Very briefly, please.
Yeah, sure. First, the public opinion. I mean, trade negotiators were shot at in Seattle '99. So I'm actually thinking that the public opinion has never been this good. But the problem is that there is really no domestic policy space for trade policy, as I said, aside in Korea. But I would say like this, when it comes to pertinent issues like climate change, we have heard several times that CBAM is non-discriminatory. Yes, if the European concept of actually treating everyone equally, whether they're clean, dirty, expensive, or cheap, that's not non-discriminatory. That's just stupid. And in other words, if the question that it will come down to in the WTO is this measure really, really necessary to the point that you need to direct it to someone like Korea? That's the fundamental legal question. And that will come down to the point that actually CBAM live or die on a hill based on how you treat a country like Korea. That will be basically the underpinning question around the legality and the morality of CBAM. That's my first point. And on the question of digital, it is indeed very true. And I think that that's something that we have a public opinion against the large platforms and the digitalization of economy. And some of them are true. Some of them might be basically simple technophobia. But I'm not going to go into that question. But it is indeed true that negotiating international agreements, even between like-minded jurisdictions like Korea and Europe, can be extremely difficult. Although we managed to achieve adequacy and privacy, it does not necessarily mean that we can actually start to look at common rules. And here's where the problem of the technical standards, I think, also comes in, which is the fact that there is no public support to do them necessarily through trade agreements. In that regard, the new Indo-Pacific strategy look at other venues of policy dialogue. And I think you're absolutely right, Isabelle, that we need to look at other forums. Trade agreements has never been a silver bullet. They have been disciplined on governments to make sure that never go too far. And they're always signed among like-minded agreements. Apparently, as it looks, Europe doesn't seem to be like-minded with anyone, not least within ourselves, because we have very different views about approaching digital trade within the EU. So that's a key point. The second point I would like to make around the technical standards, which will be my departing point, which is that technical standards, Brussels tend to believe, are created out of vacuum because we're big and beautiful and we're Europe. I was there when some of these technical standards were created in I3E and other forums, and I have to say they were created through hard work by European corporations, European policymakers, and there was a consistent thinking around it. It just didn't happen naturally. And they are currently challenged by other consortiums and other constellations that we are not used to. And I think there is a certain risk of complacency by Europe if we don't actually start to work with other countries. I'm thinking, for example, in the area of 5G. Korean companies and European companies are collaborating very openly in transparent and international organization, whereas US platforms and Chinese state-owned enterprises are trying to create a discriminatory standard against European Korean interest. So we need to really be wary of those kind of attempts together. Thank you.
So sorry, we are out of time. I think we could have continued the discussion a lot longer, but thank you very much, Minister, for taking the time. Thank you to the panelists for their input, and thank you to the Korea International Trade Association for co-organizing that with us. I think clearly the only conclusion I will draw is that cooperation is essential, and that in this new environment, we also have to find more and different ways of cooperating and continuing to talk, but very glad that we had the opportunity to have that dialogue today. So thank you very much also to the audience online, and I hope we can do this again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.